So this is a picture actually of the Bay Area from a plane. And one of the things you can see here is that it's all built in the flat, but as soon as the mountains start, there's just nothing. You can see that also here if you go to Italy, where this is a day and a night, and you can see here that all the lights are on in the valleys, and every moment, every time that you have a mountain, there is nothing, right? Why is that? Because in flatlands, the water doesn't run off. You can have agriculture that's much easier. You can have irrigation that's much easier. Plants are easier to grow. When you have a lot of that, you can have agriculture. If you have agriculture, you can have people. And then on top of this, if you have rivers that are navigable, you can trade that very easily. You can also trade more easily if there's flatlands than if there is mountains. You have more people and more wealth in flat areas. And so you have here geography determining a lot of the evolution of a place like Italy or the Bay Area. And then you can zoom out into Europe, for example, and you can realize, okay, actually this is pretty flat at the top. That's the North European plain. And you have all this south here that is very mountainous. And that's due to the African plate hitting into the European plate, Eurasian plate. And that's what's creating all these mountains at the south. And what happens then is that all the water that accumulates from here into the mountains falls very quickly into the Mediterranean because of the mountains, but very slowly in the north. And so that's why you have natural navigable waterways in the north, substantially more than the south, which means that together with the flatlands, you have more agriculture, more people, more wealth than in the south. And so you should remember this next time that you blame Southern Europeans for being lazy. Hu Line in China, 94% of the population is east of that, and that corresponds to the area that is Han. Here, these brown ones, and there's other ethnicities, but the big one is the Han. And you can see here the percentage, like red means more than 95% are Han. You can see that it's basically all of the east of that Hu Line and very little the west of it. And it's very connected to the density, right? So a huge density in this area and here in Sichuan and a little bit here more, but nothing west of it. And so why is this? Well, because of that corresponds to the cultivated land. This is the most cultivated, and it corresponds to the line of rain. East of this line, the 15-inch isoyet, you have much more density of population, and west you don't have any of it. And the more rain you have, the more population you have. And that's linked to the geography, where here you can actually see in the geography, actually the Hu Line is close to this actually. And you can see all of these are flatlands, and these on the west are mountains. And what's happening? Well, you have the winds here in the world that go east to west towards China at this level of latitude. And as they hit mountains, the wind goes up, colder air, it condensates, it falls, and then when it goes on the other side, there's no more water, and so it's very dry. And so on top of this, now you have here this tectonic plate between India and China, and it's hitting. And what's happening is that's what's creating the Himalayas on the south, and then this is the Himalayas, and this is Tibet. And so what's happening? Well, on top of this, on the east side, you remember this flat line. There's a flat land. That's the flat land. Here you have China. Here you have Korea and Japan. That flat area corresponds to the Pacific plate going under China, and wherever it arrives, it's flat, and wherever it doesn't, it has mountains from the other tectonic plate hit with India. And so you end up having these area that's influenced by the Pacific plate, this area that's influenced by the Indian plate. This is called the north-south gravity lineament line. And what's happening is it's flat east of that, mountain is west of that. So that area gathers all the water. It gathers the flat lands that are perfect for fertility. And then on top of this, then you have all the water caught by the Tibet that flows through two rivers, the Yangtze and Yellow River, into these amazing plain, the North China plain. And unsurprisingly, this is where China comes from. The Han came from that valley. And so there were so many of them because it was so fertile and so flat and so much agriculture that you had a massive population that expanded little by little through the centuries until it caught the borders of China today. And so I can keep going, but this is why China really is the Han. It's because of tectonic plates, the same reason as Europe is the way it is. And so that's these are some examples of how much geography has driven history in the past. And so if you ask this guy, this is from 1500, how are the next few decades going to be like? He's going to tell you, well, it's going to be the same as the last few centuries. Right? This is Europe in the Middle Ages, and you have this feudal system. And on top of this, you have the Catholic Church, which controls most of Western and Central Europe in 1500. And they have been growing in power for hundreds of years. And for all this time, you've had some Protestant movements appearing here and there, challenging the power of the church, but the church destroyed them every time. And so that's why in 1500 it looks like this. And then this is what it looks like 50 years later. Here we're in 1555. The green is the Catholic Church, and the other colors in the north are the Protestant. How come you have 1,000 years of Catholic church power that suddenly disappears nearly overnight? You know, this is the Reformation. But what's interesting, right? Jan Hus in the 1400 founded the Hussite movement, and he didn't succeed, but whereas Martin Luther did. And so what's the difference? The printing press. With Jan Hus, you needed to write books by hand. It took a full year for a book to be produced. So the best way to propagate your ideas was by talking, which is not scalable. Martin Luther used the printing press very, very heavily. And one of the things that he used it for is the 95 Theses. And the result was the Reformation, thanks to Gutenberg's printing press, which was created just around 70 years before the Reformation started. Geography used to drive history. Technology, like the printing press, has been replacing it. And one way to think about it is in terms of information networks, right? This is a village you have in the Middle Ages. You have maybe a nobleman like a knight, and maybe the priest, and then a few villagers that talk to each other. And you have a little bit of conversations or communication with other villages, not too much, but a little bit of trade, a little of interactions. You also have bigger cities with bigger noblemen and bigger higher level priests. And so you have these kind of fractal structure for the population, which gets reflected in the aristocracy. Yeah, right. You have knights and barons and earls and dukes and kings, and the same thing for the church, right, with priests and deacons and cardinals and the Pope, except that this one is substantially more connected. Before the printing press, you had all the priesthood that was substantially better educated. They had access to handwritten books that they could share with each other. They had a lingua franca with Latin, where all of them could talk with each other. They had correspondence with each other, a European scope. So they really had a monopoly of information and information networks in Europe. Then comes the printing press. And then suddenly ideas can be shared across aristocrats or merchants and across educated citizenry in general. And so that eliminates the monopoly that the church has on the information networks. And so if you ask this guy in 1500, hey, what's going to happen? He's going to be really freaking surprised. Right? Information technology killed the incumbent power because it replaced the existing information networks. And so the question becomes, okay, what's going to replace it, right? What's going to replace the church? As we know, it's nation states, but that also was influenced through the printing press, through a process called print capitalism. And so here, these were the language families in Europe at the time. And languages really were a gradient. So for example, here from Belgium to Lisbon, it's not like you had here some French and some Portuguese. No, it was a gradient. Little by little, these languages were different from each other. And so maybe there's a few words that change from a valley to another, but it's very, very gradual. And so what happens with this graduality is as books start being printed, the capital, the cities that were the biggest, were the ones where there were the more writers and also the more readers. And so they attracted the writing in the local vernacular. And so around these big population and culture centers appear little by little over centuries, these languages. And so that's why we have languages that we have today. This one, I think, is from this picture is from, I think, the 1400s or so, and this is from the 1600s, right? 2 centuries later, and you can see how dramatic was the concentration of power from this feudal system into these more of a nation state kind of system. And so that emergence of these new nation states replacing churches, that would have gotten these guys completely crazy. And that's not the only time that these information technologies have dramatically influenced the political structure, right? What do these guys have in common? Well, you cannot have a totalitarian system without a microphone and a speaker so that you can talk to hundreds of thousands of people in a square, or a radio that enables you to reach millions of people. Without that technology, you just don't have that political system. Over the centuries, nation states co-opted books, newspapers, radio, TV, education to strengthen this concept of we're not just a state, we're a nation too, and so we're a nation state, and those media strengthened the position of the nation state. They guided the broadcasters of information on what to tell citizens, and the feedback loop there was very weak. And so that's why they've been able to create this identity of nation states. Information technology created this new power of nation states, and it's happening again. This new information system, obviously, internet, is changing again, the political system. Obviously, the key one here is now citizens are connected. And so the information flow doesn't go from nation states through broadcasters to citizens, but citizens now are networked. QAnon and Satoshi Nakamoto are two other perfect examples of this, right? QAnon, a guy or a small group of guys that has had a dramatic influence in what tens of millions of people believe and in political representation. Satoshi Nakamoto also has had these outsized impact, creating $1 trillion asset class, a technology with it, and hundreds of millions of people who believe in cryptocurrencies more than they believe in fiat currencies and nation states. And so you have this power of citizens that comes from the fact that they're so networked, right? QAnon, Satoshi Nakamoto are impossible in a world where we're not connected. You have another big source of undermining the nation state that comes from internet, which is everything becoming digital, right? Technology is internet is eating the world, technology is eating the world. And every time one of these companies gets created, you have a behemoth that appears. So this is the revenue of travel in the 15 years after 2000. And as that grew as much, the number of travel agents went down commensurately. And this happens faster and faster and faster because the speed at which technologies get adopted is ever faster. And so what happens every time that one of these companies appears, it becomes a huge behemoth, and where it creates a lot of wealth, but it also replaces a lot of players that were local. And so it concentrates wealth that was globally distributed into a few hands that obviously have a lot of power, not only because they have all the money, but also because they have, some of them, access to information, right? In the case of Facebook, in the case of Twitter, they control information. And not only that, but now you have Elon Musk saying that Starlink is a way to give access to internet anywhere in the world, and really local governments can't really do anything about it. How does transmitting into a country with a local downlink work in the regulatory side? They can shake their fist at the sky. So you have this other source of undermining the power of nation states. You have supranational organizations. And this is interesting because it just has happened all the time in history. The question is never whether you can keep all of your sovereignty. History says that you just can't. All along, it has been the fate of humankind to have its fate increasingly shared. Before, you have violence and trade between individuals, and that forms tribes. Violence and trade between tribes forms from chiefdoms and kingdoms and empires and leagues. And then we've seen this, right? So more recently, World War I pushed for the League of Nations. World War II pushed for the creation of the UN and the European Union. As there's global financial problems, the IMF and World Bank gained power. Global trade problems gave power to the WTO. Pandemics gave power to the World Health Organization. And I argue that the failure of the World Health Organization is only important insofar as it was so unbelievably necessary. So I don't think the WHO is going anywhere. I think something like it or itself is going to keep gaining power. So whenever you have a globalized world, you will have globalized governments. And then you have blockchain, right? Bitcoin, Ethereum, and there's the obvious way in which this undermines the power of nation states, because it reduces the power of printing, of the printing press. And so the wiggle room that you have with your fiat currencies, but it goes beyond this, right? Because you have here gatekeepers like financial institutions that are one of the ways that nation states have power over its citizens. But with blockchain, you can have DeFi, and you can start taking away the power from these financial institutions. And this is true not just with financial institutions, but really wherever you have a gatekeeper, you can replace that with blockchain and decentralize that governance. So wherever you have an industry that's based in knowledge and not in something more physical, you will have an industry that can replace the gatekeepers of the nation state by something powered by blockchain. And so you have all of these potential, these actors that are reducing the power of nation states at the worst time for them, where Kodak was 150,000 employees, Instagram had just 12 people, it was sold for $1 billion, WhatsApp $22 billion by 55 employees, that's $400 million of value per employee. And so these employees in tech are generating so much wealth, they're so productive that they obviously are the ones with the biggest jobs that make the most money. And so what happens is, as these people keep working on tech, the share of GDP controlled by tech increases, but because they're so productive, actually the share of tech employees does not grow. And so you have here all these 50 jobs, top jobs in the US, and so many of them that are going to be automated. And oh, by the way, of these top 50 jobs, only 3 have been created in the last 60 years, which tells you a lot about how fast the destruction is going to be of work versus the creation. The creation, because tech is so much more efficient, the creation of jobs is not going to be as fast as the destruction. And so what you happen to have then is a lot of workers that either don't work or are underemployed, and which you cannot tax. right? It's this concept of the hollow out, where the medium skilled people, who are the vast majority of people, there's fewer and fewer of them. There's more low skilled people. There's more high skilled people, and obviously that creates the inequality in wealth that we know, with 3.5 billion people in the world that have as much wealth as the top 26. And that is hard because now you cannot tax these middle class, right? You don't have as many workers that you can tax. And so you need to tax these people who are high skilled, except that these high skilled people can move around and they can dodge your taxes. And it's true not only for the creators of these companies, but also for their, right? So this is another example, right? You know this, Lorena Gonzalez from California said this to Elon Musk, and then bam, a few months later, Elon Musk moves to Texas, where he pays substantially fewer taxes. And so this mobility of these wealth generators is true for the entrepreneurs. Like here, you have also creators. In Spain, for example, they're moving to the equivalent of Puerto Rico in Spain, which is Andorra, where they don't pay taxes. And then the same is going to be true for workers, where a share of all employees working remote during COVID was huge. And here the red is the people who want to work fully remote, according to different, in tech, according to different, in knowledge-based industries. Most people actually want either hybrid or remote, and the remote ones can go wherever they want. And so how do you tax the people who can go wherever they want, right? Companies are mobile. The richest companies are mobile. The richest owners are mobile. The richest workers are mobile. And so how do you tax them? It's going to be much harder. And so there's going to be substantially more competition for taxes than there is today, just at a moment where the average worker can be taxed substantially less. Right? It's not a coincidence that of the top 25 countries in GDP per capita, most of them are actually tax havens. And some of them have also oil, but if you take out oil, it's mostly tax havens. And that's why Shenzhen, Dubai, Singapore, Hong Kong, all these cities, which were nothing 50 years ago, 100 years ago, now there's these massive metropolises. Not a coincidence that they have low taxes. And obviously, we mentioned this, we can print money because of Bitcoin. They printed money in the United States just after the Great Recession, and it worked well. And then they tried to do this again, and it doesn't work as well, right? And you have this flight of the money to things that are hedges against it. The stock market is one of them, but obviously Bitcoin is another one of them. And as you have more cryptocurrencies, it's going to be harder and harder to print money without consequences. And so now states have fewer workers to tax. They can't tax them as much, workers and companies and founders, and they can't print money during a demographic ticking bomb, right? So this is Europe, but it's equivalent for the US. Population projection by the UN in Europe is that this year is going to be the top of the population. For now, we're going down. Is due to the number of children per woman, which is vastly under 2.1, which is the replacement rate. By the way, not a single country in the world that has gone down the 2.1 threshold has been able to go back up above it. Not a single one. So that's children per woman. Obviously, life expectancy is going up at the same time. So you don't have children, but you have a lot of older people, which means the ratio of retirees per workers in the European Union, same thing for the US, is going to go from 0.3 to 0.6, right? So for every worker, you have 0.6 retirees in a few decades. And by the way, today, the share of government budget spent on old age benefits, such as Medicare or Social Security, retirement, that's around 20% in Europe. It's slightly lower in the US, but imagine what happens when you have double the retirees. Are you going to have 40% of the entire budget of the European Union spent on this? That's not the discretionary, that's the entire budget. So nation states, the power goes down with new competing actors, such as individuals, communities, companies, supranational entities. Their income goes down because they have fewer workers to tax. They can't tax those people and companies making money. They can print money. And at the same time, their spend goes up because they have more underemployed people. So they want more redistribution and then more retirees. So nation states are not in a good position, and they are in a very similar position to where the church was 500 years ago. They were the incumbent power, and you had these information network technology, which was the book at the time, that replaced it with these new nation states. And now we have these nation states that are completely crumbling in power. And the question becomes, what will replace nation states? For that, we need to understand actually this concept, right, of nation states, where the key component, the nation, that means that my identity is loosely linked to this geography. Like in this place, there's a bunch of people, and we all share this identity, which we call the nation, and that is the logic for binding us together. This identity comes from these information networks, right? The way we're sharing information, the way we're sharing our culture through information networks, and that's what creates this nation. And it was linked to geography. States means that the governance is linked to the geography, which is linked to the fact that assets are linked to geography. What does that mean? We have the original source of states is the monopoly of violence, right? You have trade in an area, there might be crime, there might be violence, and so you grow to control that area so that you have a monopoly of violence, so that trade can happen seamlessly, and that creates value and that enriches the state. But here, what's happening is that these information networks are becoming digital, and the assets are also becoming digital. So where the nation and the state were anchored to geography, now both of them become anchored to the digital world. There's two questions, right? On the nation side, what identities will emerge? Are there going to be identities that are stronger than the nation, that undermine the nation, the same way as the nation undermined the identity of religion? And the second one is, what state services are geographically bound? Because those are geographically bound are going to remain the ownership of the geographic state. But the state services that are not bound to geography, why would they remain in the scope of a geography state? Now, for starters, English is by far the #1 language in terms of GDP globally. That bleeds enormously in languages in internet. More than 50% of all websites are in English. The result is that most popular languages being learned around the world, the English is about 20 times the second one, which is French, and is more than all the other ones combined. Why? Because of network effects. If most of the people are learning already English, you want to join that network, not another network. And so by far now, English is the most valuable language to learn. That's why everybody's learning it. And so in 1 or 2 generations, suddenly everybody will learn English, will know English. And remember what happened last time. When books evolved and grew, they created the nation around the scope of the language of the book. So now, if you have suddenly a language that's global, what happens is that the geographically bound identities are going to slowly melt away to start creating a global identity. And so that's one of the reasons why the somewheres are going to be replaced by the anywheres, right? The somewheres, people who are rooted into a geography, anywheres, people who feel comfortable anywhere in the world.